Welcome, everyone. My name is Diana. I am the community manager at the Canadian Psychedelic Association, and I'm a part of the team that is also making this webinar happen. So I'm here to welcome you and introduce you to your host. But before we get into things, we are going to take a couple of minutes to allow everyone to arrive and settle. And I'll make a few announcements while I'm here. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are coming live to you from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I apologize if I'm not saying those correctly. Please let me know in the comments where you're joining us from, and if you'd like to acknowledge the land where you are at, please do so. Um, or the like button on Facebook. That way, our webinar and our content can reach more people, and hopefully, someone who hasn't heard from us before will find this information and they'll find it useful. So please show us some love on Facebook with the reactions and the comments. It's really important. Thank you very much. Before we get started, I want to give a recognition and acknowledgement to our volunteers, the board of directors and advisory board. The Canadian Psychedelic Association would not be able to put this event together and this content without the huge amount of hours that everyone donates. So thank you very much for your donations in time and in money as well. Thank you, Christine, Roxanne, Lauren, Vincent, Emily, Shada. Thank you everyone who donated money for this event. This money is helping us covering the cost of production and daily operations. On that note, we're hosting our next town hall. This will happen on February 24th, and the details of the event will be announced on our social media and our Eventbrite page. So if you are already a CPA member, you will get an email with your ticket for this event. If you're not a member yet, please visit our website so you can find more information about how to become a member. There will also be tickets available for our town hall for people who are not members yet. So everyone is invited and welcome to join. And the purpose of the event is for you to be able to connect with other people across Canada who are interested in psychedelics or that are already in the psychedelic space. So now that we're all here and that we're ready, we are going to talk about accessing psychedelics in Canada and what are the possible paths for the future in this industry. It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce you to your host, Jillian Maxwell. Gillian brings her experience in harm reduction and drug policy reform to the CPA. She co-founded the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, and she has spoken at conferences nationally and internationally. In 2012, Gillian received a medal from Queen Elizabeth herself for her community service and introducing harm reduction to Vancouver and successfully advocating for safe injection sites. So Gillian is also a board member of MAPS Canada, and she is a founding member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. Without much more introduction, please welcome your host, Jillian Maxwell.
Thank you, Deanna. That was a great introduction. And I just have to say, listening to that, the piece that I'm so proud of is that I received the medal along with a whole group of people, not just me, but that the medal was given for service to the community, and the community that we were really serving were the most marginalized people in our society, and mostly chronic drug users and people with serious addiction issues and trauma. And the Queen of England gave us a medal for helping and supporting that group of people. Makes me really proud. And so I just want to mention that and reference that, and welcome all of you from all different parts of the globe that I can tell from the the notes that came up. And we're really excited to be hosting this webinar this afternoon. It came out as a result of just having a conversation with a couple of people here about different ideas they had how to legally change things and access psychedelics to make them more available to all of us. And it was like, well, what a great idea. We should be sharing this information with all of you. So this is why we're here this afternoon, and we're excited to be here. I'm now going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves just for a couple of minutes so that we know the really important bits that you want to tell us. And let's start with Jennifer. Jennifer Tobe.
Hi, Jillian. Hi, Diana. Hi, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this interesting discussion on our vision of the future of psychedelics in Canada. I practice in the area of Canadian cannabis and drug law, specifically the regulatory requirements for licensing and permits, and specialized applications such as Section 56 under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. I have a particular interest in the future of public drug policy in Canada, and I am actively involved in several policy projects. I will be presenting my own personal vision of where the future of the food and drug regulations could go, as well as the potential role of clergy guides or psychedelic chaplaincy in the healing process. This is my personal vision for the future of psychedelic drug policy in Canada. My discussion is a policy discussion for interest or educational purposes and cannot be construed in any way as legal advice. And now I believe we're passing over the mic to my esteemed colleague, Doug White.
Go ahead. Thank you, Jennifer.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you, Jillian, and to the Canadian Psychedelic Association for the invitation to participate. My name is Doug White. Asiam Nasiaya, Entapek Walasalton, Tanis Nanemo, Entapek Clishan, Tani Hopachasit, Nashqualawan Quanis Heidsepka, Siam Estimo. So my co-Salish name is Qualasalton, and my Nujanic name is Clishan. I'm here in the Nanaimo, British Columbia, and Snuneymuxw territory. I've been a lawyer for over a decade, and I've been the chief of my own First Nation, a leader of First Nations in British Columbia, the First Nations Leadership Council, and I've worked in negotiations for First Nations for most of my adult life. And I currently work, I'm the chief negotiator for the Lake Babine Nation up around from Burns Lake and that part of the world in the middle part of the province. I'm the chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council, which has the mandate of reforming the criminal justice system in British Columbia and in Canada, and also I'm working with a friend of mine, Lisa Pallison, in the Nature Spirit, and this is what brings me into this particular webinar. When I met with her last fall, and she shared with me the work that she was doing, I let her know that I would in this space. I let her know that I wanted to help in any way that I could, given the depth of the experience of trauma and the reality of intergenerational trauma with Indigenous peoples in this country, and the need to find Indigenous pathways with respect to healing and mental health. So that's the work that I've been up to. That's what I've been doing, and so happy to be here. Thank you very much. And I guess I'll pass it over to Mr. Robert Laurie.
Thank you very much. I am myself coming to you from, now Doug, you have to correct me, but I believe I'm living on Snuneymuxw territory, North Nanaimo here. So this is where I'm coming from today. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Doug. And yes, my name is Robert Laurie. I am a barrister solicitor. I'm an international lawyer as well. I'm licensed in England and Canada. I studied law at Oxford University prior to cutting my teeth working in corporate commercial, from big British and American law firms to the CIA's law firm on Wall Street, Sullivan and Cromwell, to coming back home in Canada, back to Canada and starting my own practice. My interest in regulated drugs goes back to very early in my life. I was 4. In fact, I'm one of the earliest diagnosed cases of ADHD that was prescribed Ritalin. I was 4. So I've had a very interesting relationship with drugs my whole life. In fact, we used to joke, and still do, given that I'm a cannabis lawyer and represent the whole 50 shades of green, as I call it, the spectrum in both cannabis and psychedelics. But we joke growing up that, well, more drugs than hot dinners. And so, again, having that experience, plus having taken on cases involving First Nations hunting and fishing, and participating in advisory boards with MAPS Canada, to the Last Prisoner Project, to Heroic Hearts in the UK and in the United States, as well as most recently working with the Decriminalized Nature Canada, and of course, SPORE in Denver. And probably the most recent psychedelic work was working with Therasil and helping achieve one of the first Section 56s, the first Section 56 for psilocybin since 1974, if my memory serves correctly. But we'll talk more about that all later. For now, it's a real honor to be here, and thank you all very much for the opportunity.
Over to you, David. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Jillian. My name is David Wood. I'm a partner at Borden Ladner Gervais, which is Canada's largest national law firm. I practice from the Calgary office of BLG, and I am in the intellectual property group. My practice is entirely in psychedelics and cannabis, and I personally practice regulatory and intellectual property law and work with licensed dealers, with cannabis companies, and with other technology companies that are innovating in this space, work with clinics that are interested in providing people with ketamine, and then in the future MDMA and psilocybin and other psychedelics. I work with Therasil. I'm allowed to tell people that. They're a wonderful group to work with. And prior to law school, I completed a PhD in structural biochemistry at the University of Saskatchewan, which is very useful for understanding some of the science behind this, particularly in my work as a patent agent, which I also am qualified as in addition to a lawyer. And I've been practicing since 2009. The start of my career was primarily patent litigation and patent agency work. In 2016, I personally received medical access to cannabis through the MMPR, and then subsequently the ACMPR, now still have it under the cannabis regulations. And once I realized how that system worked, I became very interested in working with companies and innovators in the space. And then when psychedelics became a realistic play for working with clients, it was a dream come true. Very grateful to be working in this space. I've been interested in psychedelics essentially my entire adult life, and I'm really, really thrilled with the sensible direction Canadian policy is taking, and very grateful and feel very fortunate to be, a real participant in that change, along with all the other panel members, Jillian, and I'm sure many of the people watching. So we live in a great country at a great time.
Thank you, David. So now you know, all of you, why this wonderful group of people were brought together. And we're honored to have all of you here. And before we went live, we were sort of just reviewing, why are we here? What are we doing this for? And came to Gillian anyway, came to the summation that it's because we care about people. And then each of you are bringing your specific skills and your knowledge to making the world a better place for all the people in it. And I really thank you for all the work that you do. And you're incredibly busy, and thank you for giving your time to us this afternoon. So we're actually going to go to each of you shortly and ask you what your vision is for the legal pathway to accessing psychedelics, which are quite different from each other, and it's totally fascinating. Before we do that, I think it will be really interesting to actually say, why do we have to do this? Why drugs are illegal. If anybody is not sure about that, I can send you to our CPA, Canadian Psychedelics Association website. Back to a webinar we did back last summer around why drugs are illegal. And to be absolutely clear, it's got nothing to do with the nature of the drugs themselves and whether they're harmful to people. It was all totally political, and a lot of it was a racism based. So here we are, we're still dealing with that. And if you look at the people who are most oppressed by those laws, it worked very well. So, you know, I've been dedicating my life to changing that, as many people on the here and outside of here, of course, have. And so there's that aspect of it, but there's also just, how do they enforce these laws, and what is it that we have to change, and how does that work in the world at large, in Canada, in the world at large? And so I've asked Rob if he will give us a sort of a summation of the conventions and when it all happened. It happened like such a long time ago. It's a different century, it's a different world, and we're still stuck with those damn things. And then I do remember just at the beginning here, a couple of you have just mentioned Section 56 and this and that. And so if one of you, and maybe you can include this in your piece, Rob, could say to everybody listening, what on earth does that mean? Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, you hit the nail right on the head, and I'm getting comments from people messaging me saying I should have put product in my hair. Anyway, let's just get right into it. Racism is definitely a part of it. Unfortunately, the main international conventions, the 61, the 71, and the 1988 convention, I'll go into a little more detail of those laws are still on the books. And those laws initially for the 61 convention have their roots at the early turn of the last century. Effectively, it was to deal with issues involving coca, opium, and the American anti-temperance movement. So alcohol was added to that agenda, which culminated through, again, a lot of misinformation, racism. I mean, it's well documented, led to effectively the passing of the largely American-led international convention, the 1961 convention, which effectively outlawed primarily coca, cannabis, opium, and then again, because of the American efforts with alcohol prohibition, alcohol. But where it gets really interesting from the point of view of our discussion is it comes really down to the American government, Richard Nixon, 1971. The 1971 convention, a UN convention on psychotropic substances, was brought in specifically because of the use of these substances. And let me digress for a moment. Psychedelics are not new. Okay, they've been around for, in some instances, 15,000 years in terms of documented use. You have use, of course, of natural plant medicines in the ayahuasca, shamanic UDV, Santo Daime use, to Huico Aboriginal use of peyote, to Siberian shamanic uses of Amanita muscaria, with the Bwiti people in Gabon, West Africa, and their use of ibogaine, throughout indigenous use of any number of other plant medicines. So, in fact, these are not new, but in 1971, because of the anti-war movement, you effectively had the first time in history, and this is according to Mark Hayden's slide that he allowed me to use recently, which for the first time in history, psychedelics were labeled as being antisocial, which of course is very ironic and diametrically opposite to how psychedelic use has been throughout history. I mean, the experiences were traditionally guided by elders and were used by communities for healing and the celebration of transitions, you know, very much from, adolescence into a more mature stage. You had, again, the connection to the culture and family and the exploration of spirituality. But for some reason, 1971 and the 70s, this is, again, the first time that these psychedelics were labeled as antisocial. And ultimately what it boils down to is, well, the CIA was worried that propaganda and American youth would refuse to fight in Vietnam. There was effectively a view that cultural change that was already happening and inevitable would have been spurred on further if psychedelic use and access thereto was readily available. And so it points to interesting instances where, have there been any other instances in history where science has been banned? And well, unfortunately, the answer is yes. And you only have to look as far as to the banning of the telescope. So books that, again, were advocating anything different than the Copernican system were banned. Anything saying that the Earth is not the center of the universe was basically banned and not revoked until 1758. So, this is why personally, for me, my interest and fascination and access to all medications is because there either needs to be sensible rules in place for this, or you're going to allow the black market and illicit markets to thrive. And having represented at one point 40% of the black market dispensaries that were operating, at least British Columbia, I had the opportunity to advise governments, sue governments at all three levels, work with governments. And unfortunately, what it all boils down to is governments, even in legal cannabis, their hands are tied because of these three conventions. And the last convention, before I hand it back to the group, is the 1988 convention, which was totally American-led, dealing with anti-trafficking efforts. So again, you can see that these laws and these rules, which again limit any type of access and use, and technically even still to cannabis, is limited to scientific and medical research, right? Which is where further excitement in the space with the changing from the Trump administration to a Democratic Biden administration signals that there will be hope that a lot of these conventions and the rules that prevent the banking and the access and the participation that is required will hopefully be revisited. But ultimately, this was an American-led problem, which unfortunately requires an American-led solution at the domestic and international level to change these laws and conventions. And I think until really those efforts happen, you're going to end up with just what I look at as pigeonhole exemption, which is fine, but are these exemptions are created out of laws that arguably should never have been passed in the first place and should have been amended a long time ago. So really, it's against that backdrop that we find ourselves now. And I think it's a nice place to leave off to where passages or access towards legalization and what that looks like can certainly be discussed. And if I'm missing any other points, I mean, I defer any further time to the panelists for their brief thoughts on, where we've come from, and I guess, where we are before we get to talk about where we're going.
Before we ask the rest of the panel, and thank you, that's fantastic, Rob. I do have a couple of clarifying questions. So, and the first one is, so does that mean our hands are tied then as a country, that we simply can't say, we're sick of this, we're going to change, and we're not going to have these things be illegal anymore? How does that work?
Well, the CDSA, which is our Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and our Food and Drug Act and the Food and Drug Regulations effectively embody and entrench through the domestic passage of laws through parliamentary democratic system by the creation of the CDSA, which effectively is the amendment of the Narcotic Control Act, which was the enabling statute to incorporate international law and implement that law into domestic law. So technically, the Queen is only bound by the laws of which are signed and validly put through the process. That means that Canada could very well amend what that relationship looks like through orders in council as they apply to regulations. But ultimately, the only grounds that we see with regards to access have to do with medical or scientific. And that is because that is what is allowed under the international convention. So not to get sidetracked, but discussions about decriminalization and legalization, I mean, they effectively just mean that these policies and laws that are brought in under the criminal code, combined with the Food and Drug Act and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, well, it's depending on whether or not they will be prosecuting those offenses depends, of course, on is this personal possession and better to divert these folks out of the criminal justice system? Or, you know, if these are full-scale, large producers, clearly that's not personal possession. And prosecution of that would be, of course, very much on the books as being in the interests of the laws on the books. So ultimately, it's a big game of flinching and or staring down and who is going to flinch first. And so ultimately, state and municipal decriminalization only addresses a very limited facet with respect to prosecution budgets and whether or not we want to tie into the criminal justice system these offenses at the expense of prosecuting serious assault cases and murder. So ultimately, this is where we're left in, is because of international law and regulation. It's, and forgive my language, it's kind of like we're left with the shitty end of the stick, and we have to figure out creative solutions within that end of the stick. But as we'll learn when we talk about our visions, I don't think you need to settle for the stick. You need to effectively get to the high ground with a charter issue in order to expand these rights further.
Okay, David, please, I have another question for you, Rob. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, just to add to what Rob said, the conventions name a list of substances, and the conventions require deprivation of liberty to be a consequence of the possession of any of those substances, unless it's for a medical or scientific purpose. And where I have a lot of, you know, hope and perspective here is the fact that we've already just contravened the 1961 convention with the Cannabis Act. So we've done it once. We've got a system that we think works to, you know, to make these things, to let people buy cannabis products and buy them without a medical or scientific purpose. And because we're willing to do that by amending an act, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, to remove cannabis, it's not a stretch to me that the government would also be, because it is the legislature that has to do it. A lot of people say it's Health Canada's rules. It isn't. It's the federal government's rules. Health Canada is the regulator. But the federal government could amend regulations, the food and drug regulations under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which are Part J and Part G, could be amended, and other regulations could be enacted, which would look a little bit like the ACMPR, the Cannabis Medical Access Regulations under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act prior to the Cannabis Act, when cannabis was still a controlled substance. Regulations, without amending an act of parliament, which is a more difficult process, regulations could be put into place that would give medical access to psilocybin or any psychedelic or any drug for that matter. But I think we're here talking about psychedelics, where for a number of reasons it's more compelling than with a lot of other drugs. To be accessed kind of like this could have been, or could be medically, where it's not really a drug product per se, but it's something with an active pharmaceutical ingredient in it. Those regulations could be amended or created to make that happen for medical purposes. And because we were willing to do that with cannabis prior to the Cannabis Act, and then because we were willing to take the next step with cannabis specifically, I'm hopeful that we can get, as a country, work within the UN conventions. And then if we think it makes sense to go outside of them for adult use to mitigate social and economic harms that result from abuse of drugs, which is the purpose of those, you know, and maybe this is a way to mitigate the social and economic harms of cannabis abuse. I guess I'm just hopeful that might happen. But I'm also cognizant that small steps that focus primarily on medical first at the federal level is probably where we're going to see the most movement, like we already have.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And we're going to go into that in a bit more detail. Thank you, David, for that. Just one more piece. Somebody asked the question, and it's my question too. So if that's the case with the conventions, and it could be the medical could be the way around it, then how did Canada pull it off with cannabis then? It's not just, huh?
They haven't yet. They've passed laws and they're hoping that Trudeau's hand is not smacked away from the cookie jar. Now, if a third world country were to do this, and others have, and I work for a company that's international based in Panama, who's advised over 10 federal sovereign governments. And what it boils down to right now is the international banking and regulatory and accounting. A number of companies tried to do things in Jamaica and Colombia without legally sourced feedstock, which was fine. It was permitted under the regs, but the banks who then got the audit reports and found out that these companies had operated illegal, they closed the bank accounts and then retained the company that I work for to do the licensing properly. So again, Canada has done something, but within our borders, no one has really challenged it yet. And to say that Canada is in home free, it's just no one's got around this. There's bigger pressing issues than what Canada is doing with cannabis, just like no one cares about Holland and the Netherlands, who've been dealing with cannabis legally out the front door, illegally acquired through the back door. But it's ultimately, what are they going to prosecute, just like in the minds of a prosecutor? But the law at the end of the day is on the books, which is very limited in what we can do. So Canada is getting away with it, but Uruguay did it first. We're just the first country that could very well be impacted if we lose our bank accounts and ability to transfer money internationally.
Fascinating. Totally fascinating. Well, thank you for that. And just if you could just explain to people, then we're going to go into your visions, each of you. But this is a wonderful backdrop to that. Just when somebody mentions an exemption to Section 56, could somebody just say briefly what that means to everybody that doesn't know?
Well, under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, Section 56 is a ministerial exemption if it can be demonstrated on a medical or a scientific ground, and that's up to the declarants to satisfy that hurdle. It was first done in cannabis in 2001 with Terry Parker, and most recently, and David can certainly speak to the involvement with Therasil, but I was involved with the legal team to one point in that challenge. But again, it ended up satisfying the minister, and again, and that there was enough there to grant the exemption. But as we'll discuss, as part of the defect with this model is there's no legal supply, there's nothing from a traceable, trackable source. Are we talking about psilocybin from a natural biological source, or are we talking about lab-produced psilocybin and it's EU GMP certified, right? At the end of the day, the minister has created more questions than she has provided answer to those. And I don't know if this has set Therasil up for success, but it's certainly opened the door for a dialogue. And that's effectively where we're at with it's a ministerial exemption, meaning that the possession under the terms of the license enable the license holder to be in possession and use that substance within the parameters authorized. And yeah, that's David, and others can certainly speak to that in way more detail.
I'd also add that so a subsection 56(1) exemption can be issued for any purpose that the minister thinks makes sense. Until August 4th, 2020, the only real way these were issued was for scientific research. And while I'm seeing Jen disagreeing, Santo Daime, also for religious. But I'd say one of the most, well, Jen obviously has something to add here, but in my experience, the ones that I've worked with prior to these ones and since, prior to these medical possession ones, are for scientific research. I'd say that's probably the most common reason they're issued. And when they're issued for scientific research, the companies who are getting them issued are often universities or private researchers who need to use a defined amount of a controlled substance in a scientific study. They will name the source and they will purchase from that source. And that's one thing I'm very interested in seeing as a next step in what right now is effectively an ad hoc basis to allow people authorization to possess on, is the same thing, but where a source is identified, where a licensed dealer is identified and can then transact with either the healthcare practitioner or the patient themselves, just like happens when a university or other institute has a subsection 56.1 exemption added. And I think that's the important thing to remember about them. I'd say just to remember two things. One, each issuance of a subsection 56.1 exemption is ad hoc and will be assessed on its own merits by the Minister of Health, not by the physician. And two, that they can do anything that the minister decides they should do, like the city of Vancouver's radical idea. And I say radical in all respect. I hope it works, and I'm interested to see what happens if it doesn't, to allow anyone in city limits to possess any controlled substance without fear
They
of
already
arrest.
do. That's the problem.
Well, it's yes. As someone from Calgary, I was always rather alarmed by what was considered acceptable to do in public in Vancouver. Alarmed and impressed. Jen, I think you were going to talk about religious and other exemptions.
I wasn't.
Oh, okay.
I think we'll get into that when we get into that.
But it has quite wide applications from anybody who wants to enter into Canada with a substance that's considered a controlled substance that's not readily available here, or institutions, governments, access to legal drug supplies, those kinds of things. Right?
Okie dokie. Well, I think we've set the stage pretty well. Thank you very much. And now we're going to go into each of your vision for how you see the pathway to success, to making psychedelics available. And you've got about 6 or 8 minutes each to develop it, and you can take us, less than that if you want to. Please don't take way longer, but let's see how it goes. And then I'm encouraging you all to weigh in or discuss with each other if you see something that you can contribute to that vision. Probably saying, oh, that will never work is not really terribly helpful in this context. But if you're listening to one of your colleagues and you go, oh my God, they should, what about doing this? Then please have that conversation with each other today. And so why don't we start, I'm going to change the list around here a little bit. I'd like to start with Doug White. I'd like you to tell us about your conversation with Lisa and where it's taken you so far, and what the vision is and what the potential possibility is. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Gillian. I'm happy to do so. This is such a fascinating issue and space for me. And, my talk here about the vision is mostly confined to the Indigenous sort of lens of looking at this issue, and I defer to my colleagues here on the panel for their legal expertise in that they're going to be addressing. But for me, what I'm talking about and focused on is the Indigenous aspect of Indigenous legal orders and traditions, Indigenous law, in Aboriginal rights in the Canadian constitutional framework, and the application of the UN Declaration. So when my friend Lisa Pallison came and met with me in the fall and shared with me what her project is about and what her work has been and where she's going, what she wants to achieve of making available Indigenous medicines to Indigenous people through an Indigenous framework of therapy and health, it sort of was like being hit by lightning in some way because of my own experiences as a First Nations leader, in part, being the chief here at Snuneymuxw, and I can recall creating economic opportunities for my people that were then very difficult for us to find people that were in a position to be able to take up those opportunities for work or whatever it may be. And I recall one instance where we did find someone that was able to take up the opportunity, but then was dismissed from the work within a few weeks because of addictions issues. And in my experience, what we've experienced from colonialism, through the residential school and otherwise, has led to an incredible depth of trauma and intergenerational trauma for Indigenous peoples that has to be addressed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission process that was established a number of years ago to look into some of that history and to try to move us forward from it in some way. Basically we asked 10,000 plus Indigenous peoples in Canada, can you please come and tell your story? These are stories that we don't talk about in our families because they're painful. They're ugly experiences, horrendous abuse that people don't want to talk about. Well, we were asked to talk about it, so we did. And I've not been particularly impressed with the level of follow-up. And you don't entertain or you don't ask people to talk about these things without being in a position to be able to help them grapple with the reality of talking about those ugly, traumatic experiences. And I've seen studies of West African country that went through a TRC a number of years ago. From a psychological perspective, people went in to ask, okay, so 5 or 6 years ago, you went through a TRC process in your country. How's everybody doing? And the result was obvious. In the context of the victims from that country's history, talking about and engaging in the truth and reconciliation process created spikes in depression, anxiety, PTSD, and all of those things. So here in Canada, we've seen that. I've witnessed that reality directly in my community and other communities in this country, of people, the impact of being asked to talk about that particular grotesque episodes in people's lives and in families' lives and in our country's history. And so I've got a really clear view that my own work has to be in some way aimed at helping with mental health. So I've been and dealing with trauma. And in my own role as the chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council, I know that one of the main driving factors of the wreckage that plays out in the criminal justice system has to do with addictions. And we know that the addictions are about trying to grapple with the pain of underlying trauma. And we know that the Western system of dealing with that has not been successful for my people. It has not led to people's underlying traumas or the addictions being resolved. Some years ago, First Nations in British Columbia, we had a big meeting of all of the chiefs of British Columbia. We got together and we talked about the opportunity for taking over federal jurisdiction for the delivery of healthcare services in this province for Indigenous peoples. And I was, I think I was on I must have been on the Leadership Council at the time. I was asked to give one of the opening speeches and talks. And what I talked about was how I know this is a big, important step. It's not the full scope of the provincial healthcare system. It's the federal dimension of health services in this province. But it is one important step that brings us to a different place than where we've been. And for me, one of the biggest opportunities is I talked about my grandmother, Dr. Ellen White, Qualasselwood, and the fact that she was had training from her grandmother around health and mental health and healing, and was a ritualist and a healer in the Coast Salish tradition. And I said, what's important for me about this moment in this work is that we're now, if we take this step collectively as Indigenous peoples, it gets us on a path of where we're able to shape the healthcare system to reflect and to be grounded in our own traditional knowledge and teachings about health and mental health, about what it means to be sick and what it means to be better and how you get from one place to the other. What it means to me is that we're going to be able to get the teachings of my grandmother and other people like her to be relevant to the healthcare system in this province. When I was being trained by her and raised by her, she taught me about the use of psychedelics. She showed me the mushrooms that she uses in her own work. And so now that's a part of the teachings, what comes to us from our ancestors and comes to us from the Creator about how to look after ourselves. It's knowledge that comes from thousands of years of working with and being in a relationship with those plants. So when I want to share with you now, so we did go. The chiefs of British Columbia agreed. We're on that path. So that was an important step. But I want to talk a little bit about. So there's a BC First Nations Health Authority as an example that is in place now, and it wasn't in place a decade ago. I want to share something. Robert was talking about international conventions. There's a resolution of the General Assembly that we call the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's not. It's an international instrument. It's not the same as a convention. They're slightly different, but nonetheless, it's a statement from that international body about the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I want to share with you Article 24 of that declaration. It says, Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access, without any discrimination, to all social and health services. That's part one. And part two says, Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. States shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of this right. So that's the UN Declaration. And now in British Columbia, in late 2019, we had the BC government issued the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. An important part of that is a commitment from the government of BC to, first of all, that the UN Declaration applies, but that they've got an important project that they have is to amend existing provincial law to ensure that there's alignment with the UN Declaration. And then also we now have the federal bill C-15 that is now currently being considered. It's been through first reading, and it includes, which is a similar kind of law. It's not identical, but it's very similar about the way of bringing that international law into the domestic space. And one of the commitments in the the federal law is the same consistency provision that Canada itself has a project of bringing the laws of Canada into alignment with the UN Declaration. So this is for me, this is important work. We've Robert and others talked about decriminalization. I don't like the fact that my grandmother's teachings are illegal and criminalized by Canadian law. Indigenous peoples, we've seen the work of Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, the report that she did that was issued this winter, where she made clear there's serious problems of systemic racism and discrimination in BC's healthcare system. There's a lot of trust issues because of that reality. Indigenous peoples are leery of going to get healthcare because of that reality. That I mean, believe it or not, going to get healthcare in this province can sometimes and often does for Indigenous people represent a threat to the integrity of Indigenous families. And so part of my work is to seek to apply these basic, both the Indigenous right to traditional medicine, the international right to Indigenous medicine, to do the work that's necessary to ensure that there is safe space for Indigenous peoples to access their traditional medicines in a way where they don't feel like they're doing something criminal or illegal, that they feel safe and confident and assured that this is part of their traditions. It's protected by the Constitution, and it's recognized in UNDRIP, and that we're making sure that that space is properly established. So that's obviously a little bit longer term work, but my hope is that we're able to do that work with Indigenous peoples across the country to bring about the necessary changes. So
Doug.
to finish and conclude. Yeah.
Could I ask you to just give us really brief, because we're sort of at the end of the time, but I really want to hear the vision that Lisa introduced to you and that you're working with her on.
Yeah, so I mean, and as I said in my earlier comments, the basic vision is that we find ways to establish those kinds of clinics and settings where we can help and in a therapeutic context make available to Indigenous peoples treatment of the kind that my grandmother provided to people when she was alive, and that we know can be so powerful and useful in a way that the Western medical system has not, to address trauma, addictions, and otherwise. So we've been working to.
And is this in particular, though, on land that is under your jurisdiction, under First Nations jurisdiction? Isn't that like a key component?
That's part of it for sure. And, you know, it's about, you know, this is not an approach of parachuting in some different ideas from some different part of the world. This is about working with Indigenous peoples that have this similar kind of tradition to be able to have that therapy context deeply rooted in the First Nations history and traditions itself, in their places, on their lands, to help our people deal with the horrendous trauma issues that we have, that we all know Indigenous peoples have suffered from, so that we can break. I mean, you know, let me finish with this. I've, over the course of my life, you know, so sort of in my adult life, 30 years of working for Indigenous peoples, I've come to the conclusion that my basic work is to protect the younger generation of Indigenous peoples from the trauma that exists in our communities. Like, that's the basic work, is that we've got to find a way to sever the horrible spirals and cycles of trauma and the way that manifests in so many awful ways. We've got to find a way to protect and to just sever it, to break the back on this once and for all. And so I really do see that the work that Lisa Pallison is doing, and Nature Spirit, and the work that all of you are doing in different ways to open up and to make this kind of therapy that I believe is so potentially powerful to deal with the underlying traumas, to heal the underlying trauma, rather than medicating the symptoms of that trauma and the way that it plays out. So I'll stop there. I know that I've taken, you know, however many minutes it's been now, but that's the vision that I have, and I've got nothing but respect for, you know, that's the narrow lens of the Indigenous approach. But in our work, we'll be working with Section 56 exemptions and special access permits, or whatever pathways exist now for the earliest access. We will be embracing and looking to see how we can work with that. But the longer term project is to get to a place where Indigenous traditions are acknowledged as such and respected, and that they're allowed to be implemented in a way where they are not criminalized. Thank you very much, and look forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
May it be so. Aho. Thank you so much. Jennifer, I'm going to go to you. We're going to have the group discussion at the end, so you will have an opportunity to say your vision. And over to you, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really been an interesting conversation. So I am reading from a script, so I apologize. I'm still formulating my ideas regarding a vision for a revised regulatory environment, but here is a brief summary of my current thoughts. I would like to see 2 streams of regulatory licensing under the Food and Drug Regulations. The first stream, for synthetic drugs, would be to move psychedelic substances falling under the Restricted Drugs Part J of the Food and Drug Regulations, and I believe some questions were asked about this, to another part of the Food and Drug Regulations, either Part G for controlled drugs, or a newly created part of the Food and Drug Regulations that would allow for the production, distribution, sale, and possession of psychedelic drugs in controlled circumstances. Secondly, I would like to see the creation of a new parallel natural health products regulation, specifically for traditional medicines containing a controlled substance. There currently is no food and drug regulation for traditional medicines containing a controlled substance. I like this concept as I think it has a broader application beyond psychedelics for plant or fungi medicines that have value, but require regulatory controls in place for public safety. A new regulation for traditional medicines containing a controlled substance could also provide for innovation in cultivation, research, and a different kind of traditional plant or fungi medicine clinical trial program specifically for traditional medicines containing a controlled substance with known traditional usages and allow for innovation. In addition to the required regulatory changes under the Food and Drug Regulations to enable legal controlled access to psychedelic substances, I believe we need a responsible regulatory body that can determine adequate levels of training for licensing, ensuring, monitoring, and censoring trained guides that are not part of the traditional medical model, such as psychiatrists or psychologists. Finally, I believe the participation and training of clergy from all faiths in psychedelic-assisted therapy will be key to the future of palliative care and public mental health. From a long-term view of where healthcare could go, clergy involvement from all denominations seems, in my view, a good choice. Medicine and science have no way to address the phenomenon described as mystical during a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy session. Clergy provide an incredible service to the ill and dying and the associated existential crisis. Clergy trained in psychedelic-assisted therapy can provide a service that psychologists, psychiatrists, and other therapists do not generally provide. They visit homes and hospitals and work in smaller communities. I have been and continue to be involved in policy proposals and initiatives that I hope will lead to positive change for caring professionals wishing to participate in a new psychedelic healing model. However, these projects are multi-year in nature. If you have, anyone that's listening, have some thoughts or ideas that you think may contribute to developing the regulatory model, I welcome your email. Thank you for your time.
May that be so. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for your passion for this. It's a beautiful thing. So we're going to move over to our next person, which is Rob. Take it away, Rob. Tell us about your vision, please.
Well, I'm very skeptical of government, and I think we have to proceed very cautiously when it comes to their understanding. I mean, they haven't really got the rollout of the vaccine and the ability to manufacture and deal with COVID. So I think they've got their work cut out for them with respect to bigger issues and fish to fry. And unfortunately, it's just demonstrated, this COVID virus and pandemic has already demonstrated to the extreme to which the public health system and public resources are strained and stretched to the brink. And well, the nice thing is I'm a lawyer. I represent clients doing things on all sides of the line. And the nice thing is when the government doesn't figure it out, the black market does to some extent. And as a lawyer, the nice thing is about that is you represent people that, put it this way, they're going to challenge where the line is. And that's how we started with Therasil. The story and the success of Therasil is very different than what was set out to accomplish. In fact, it's one of the reasons I'm no longer involved as a lawyer with Therasil. It basically came down to the situation where you had you still have an absolute prohibition on these substances. They're effectively on Part J of the Food and Drug Regulations that were put on that list by the former Harper government as a means of trying to shut down and close the special access procedure. So again, none of this was new. Doctors, scientists, researchers could make the case. The case, however, for the work and the research would have been denied and restricted because of any number of reasons. And so we're seeing the fallibility of, again, the ability of government really to understand the issue and to solve the issue. And so I am interested in, of course, I'm not First Nations, but I represent a number of First Nations, and I've been involved with plant medicine projects in the Amazon, in Mexico, in addition to Canada. And you know, the neat thing is my interest in law actually stems from roots in environmental activism, and the Greenpeace tradition of bearing witness is very near and dear to my heart. And it's the same approach by which I proceed with psychedelics. I've traveled extensively through various places to engage with psychedelics in traditional settings under people that actually understand and know what they're talking about, which is different than the masses out there trying to navigate those waters. However, for me, I take a page from Quanah Parker and the Native American church, whereby they had to utilize peyote traditions and combine that with a Christianity religion as a means, not of creating a religion, but for the Comanche people preserving their way of life and their identity. Had it not been for the Native American church in some instances utilizing these medicines behind religious exemptions would have led to the eradication and extermination beyond the remains of some of these great nations. And so First Nations problems clearly require First Nations solutions. However, for the rest of us, I think the recognition of the limits of charter protections as they come to issues of access to medicine have to come to a realization that this is the same government and governments who, until recently, had a very firm playbook on how they would handle and address these medicines. So I think it's healthy to have an amount of skepticism, but by the same token, governments also have to be shown and provided solutions and strategies. So it can't all be the wooden stick approach, but it does work. Unlike Australia and New Zealand, which do not have charters, Canada does. And the medical access jurisprudence for cannabis took, it was easily 15 to 18 years from the first Section 56 exemptions to where we had some form of legalization. And people, I think, mistakenly associate just because these are plant medicines or have compounds of these medicines which can be synthesized in labs are going to fall like dominoes just because cannabis did. I think it's going to be a very different approach. So for me, what does my vision look like? Well, my vision looks at the fact that these laws have a long way to go. They're not going to change themselves on their own. Part of their interest that certainly the legal clout got behind Therasil was to attack and address an absolute prohibition. Unfortunately, fortunately, the way it played out with getting the exemptions, they decided they didn't need a legal team anymore to do this. So the access and advancement is really just down to special interest groups now, as opposed to doing what was set out to be done, which was challenge the law, the absolute prohibition. The government would not have had the means to justify an exemption based on the scientific evidence that was mounted in support of the granting of the exemption. So we're really at a state of play here where the law on the books is what it is. No one's challenging that. But who will be is the black market that is ramping up faster and is more mobilized and better equipped at doing anything with this than any of these so-called companies you see at the moment. In fact, most of the black market in cannabis applied for bogus research and development licenses and fabricated relations with academic institutions to be able to do things at the scale and the guise of which you're seeing that all over again right now with psychedelics. So as soon as you start seeing groups that say, to hell with these bad laws, we're just going to be providing access in a way that makes sense, cloaking our dealings in either a religious exemption, or they'll just sail right into the storm with Section 7 protections and roll the dice with the Supreme Court with respect to the fact that government has completely failed to address any of these realities, but for very limited access that Therasil, based on the fact that they were going to be sued, are suing the government for a judicial review and a Section 7 charter challenge into an absolute prohibition, which was very difficult having the discussion with the experts that litigation was canceled and that we won't be needing affidavits any further, but I'm sure they'll figure it out. Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but ultimately what Section 56 access or special access procedure access is just part of the limited part of the story. It's a start, but ultimately what I want to see for my vision is that these laws enable those that know what they're doing, who are able to source supply either from licensed lab produced or from sustainably, ethically sourced natural suppliers, which again is who I work with, and that we're applying for religious exemptions in Canada because we already have the connections with the religious groups in the regions which already are reciprocated and recognized in Canada. So again, it's what box can you fit into? What precedent will the government look at? And so again, there's a number of strategies, but ultimately the government is the biggest impediment in the way to changing these. And I don't think clergy have a place in psychedelics beyond very limited confines within that group or that faith. But I'll be honest, for the amount of psychedelics that I've done, you realize that the creator and the divine energy comes from within. The last thing I want is someone in a hat in Rome or at another religion trying to convey something that quite in reality, I don't need them. What I need is limited boundaries and access and the ability to engage in these substances in a meaningful, lawful manner. And I mean, we're not there yet, but that's what I do for a living. I fight for those access. I advise for avenues to those. And I mean, the door is open just a crack now, but it needs to be kicked open wider, and that's going to take a group effort.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So just to remind you that, we're not allowing the "it'll never work" response to someone else's idea, and when when we actually talk about everybody's ideas, we're going to do that in a moment. But I love the wide range of ideas and visions here, and I'm looking forward to the group discussion. And of course, we have some questions as well from our viewers. Just want to say one more thing, and that is one of the reasons why that you talked about how that sort of subterfuge in the cannabis legalization was brought about with, people that didn't know what they were doing, pretending they did and pretending to be researchers and all that stuff, and just in order to make an enormous amount of money. And that was one of the things that got the founding members of the CPA actually in action to try and put in place whatever is necessary to avoid that happening. And I see that that is happening to some extent, but I think we can do it differently. So thank you for now. Over to you, David, and tell us please about your vision.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to. So I'll just start with where I'd like to see it end, and as a destination, which is respecting cognitive liberty and disconnected from any therapeutic purpose, disconnected from any religious basis or cultural basis. If someone wants to experience a state that they feel they benefit from, and that is not in any reasonable way associated with significant toxicity, in my view, there should be a way that an adult can do that, particularly when there's the amount of safety evidence, safety data rather, and also recognizing widespread, in some cases, wildly irresponsible use just from illicit sources with so few negative consequences, other than consequences that come from, being in a state where you are in the wrong place at the wrong time to be in that state. Less the effects of the drug itself, more the effects of how it's used. If that's the greatest danger of these things, and we live in a country where I can pay money to jump out of an airplane if I want to, I really think we need to end in a place where I can experience the limits of what my consciousness can give me this way as well. But that's a destination. I think we've got a few stops on the way to that destination. And I guess I'd start with one premise, is that the way I look at it, drugs are not illegal. Treason is illegal. Murder is illegal. There are some drugs that are controlled substances. So we're already at a different place. They're not illegal, but they are controlled substances, which means you can't just have them. But people get prescriptions for controlled substances all the time, and we just have some that there's no recognized medical use for. These ones are called restricted drugs, and they're listed in the Schedule 2 Part J of the Food and Drug Regulations. Good examples of these would be LSD, psilocybin, 2CB, dimethyltryptamine. What we all think of as psychedelics are the majority of the restricted drug list. So one can work with them right now through a dealer's license, and I think that's where the work is being done now. And then that's it. That's the extent of it. Right now, one can have a dealer's license to deal with these substances, meaning to synthesize or cultivate them, to work with them, and to study them. And then through a subsection 56(1) exemption, one can study them, or for a few Canadians, access psilocybin specifically. Although I shouldn't really use the word access, possess psilocybin for therapeutic purposes. There's no real place to access it given, and I'll address that in my vision of where it could go next in a few minutes. But the place it's going to go for sure, without any doubt in any reasonable person's mind, is that there are going to be soon prescription drugs. MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, barring something unexpected or unusual, is going to make an MDMA drug product that should be available for on-label use of PTSD I've heard estimates varying between 2 and 3 years. I don't know. That's crystal ball gazing to an extent, but imminent. So that's the first part of my vision, is that there will be prescription drugs right away for MDMA, and then Compass Therapeutics and Usona Institute both have advanced clinical trials for psilocybin drug products. So we'll probably see those drug products as well. Those are prescription drug products. And they'll be used in a way that's different, a lot more therapist time, a lot less milligrams of drug per patient. But then the other thing that's very interesting about Canada, and in a different context, Oregon, is that we're going to have this system, a lot like medical access to cannabis, where you have some stuff that's a substance that's used for therapeutic purposes, but does not have a drug identification number. Much like a cannabis product, although in this case, we're still where we were in the late 90s and early 2000s with cannabis, where it's ad hoc subsection 56(1) exemptions. I think the next stop is, as Jen mentioned, move psilocybin, maybe other psychedelics too, but maybe at least psilocybin from the restricted drugs list, either to a new part of the controlled drugs list. The controlled drug regulations are for drugs that many of which do have a medical purpose, and they're divided into 3 parts in the Schedule to Part G of the Food and Drug Regulations, and that is stimulants, sedatives, and anabolic steroids. One could add a 4th part for, I don't know what the right term would be, we'll say psychedelics, and now they're going to be treated differently, because once you're a controlled drug instead of a restricted drug, more commercial activity is possible. However, it would still all require a drug identification number to be sold. And again, that will happen. We will see that happen. But maybe it's possible to sell psilocybin products outside of that. We do, after all, have a way to sell cannabis products that are just flower. This is a jar that came with dried flower in it. We have 350 pages of regulations about how these products work, how they're labeled, how they're made safely, how they're dealt with, how they're commercialized, how they're imported and exported. And these regulations are so thick because we're talking about a product that's sold on the basis of it being psychoactive, and people are buying it because it's psychoactive. We don't have other products really regulated that way in Canada. And these regulations are also so thick because they're setting up a commercial market for stuff that contravenes a UN convention. That being the case, we have to be really careful about how we work with it. I don't think we need to go that far with psilocybin, and I don't think we will today. I think it'll start if there is a regulated access system like cannabis, and there may never be. I hope there will be. But if there is, it'll probably look something like this, where you have, certain classes like dried fruiting bodies or extracts or synthetic psilocybin that are turned into products, packaged, tracked, labeled, warning signs, whatever they need to put on it. And then a new set of regulations that look a lot like Part 14 of the cannabis regulations, which allow medical access. They set up a system for the products to be made, another system for the products to be sold, and then another system to make it clear that these products are not regulated under the Food and Drugs Act, just like this stuff isn't. So all of that could easily be done with regulation amendments, not amendments to an act. If all that stuff was done, then psilocybin products could be sold through that system. Now, I've been saying psilocybin. If we did that, then we'd have a set of regulations that knows how to deal with substances that are psychedelic, and I'll take that to mean they induce these very valuable states of consciousness that can be leveraged in psychotherapy to help people, and that people commonly seek out illicitly. And the products could be made with that in mind, and they could be distributed with that in mind, and they could be otherwise regulated from promotional activity perspective or other things like that from that perspective. And we've already gotten relatively good at this. People love to criticize Canada's regulated cannabis system. It's the first one on earth on this scale. It's not going to be perfect. I like it a lot better than what I was experiencing prior to it. But I'll also add this. If that system is implemented for psilocybin, which is the most comparable to cannabis of the psychedelics, because you can buy dried fruiting bodies, which is kind of like buying dried flower. If it works with that and society doesn't collapse and mental health is better, well, maybe it's going to be possible to add LSD or DMT or MDMA to those lists, because I think those four have quite a bit of safety data to them. And again, we have experience regulating something that used to be a controlled substance to be a consumer packaged good. We have the skill set. We can do that. So that's where I could see this going in parallel to pharmaceutical development. And then again, as a destination, the way I like to look at it is I can pay for psychotherapy right now if I want to, without a diagnosis. I can just go do it to feel better. Well, maybe once MDMA is a prescription drug for a couple of years and we realize that it's okay if people do this and we're not seeing widespread disintegration of social contract, then, which I'm confident will be the case, then maybe it'll be the case that people can get MDMA-supported psychotherapy without a prescription. And then maybe if that's happening enough, we eventually as a society, bearing in mind this is a country where I can just buy a vape pen, maybe we get to the spot where we accept that there's a way to have a place that lets people do this in an environment where there are certain responsible safeguards in place. And maybe there's a point where you can get a license to buy it and not go to that place. Maybe if you qualify or you pass certain screening criteria. And I appreciate how Robert, and with respect to anything on a First Nation, that's different. I'm only talking about what would apply in Canada at large. But I don't think that stepping into this slowly is necessarily a bad thing. There is a certain allure to kicking the door down. I'm not really criticizing that approach, but I think pragmatically, we are where we are. There's all kinds of crazy laws on the books. Controlled substance laws have a lot of inconsistencies in them, but I'm more optimistic about working within the system. Again, recalling that they are not illegal. They are simply controlled substances. Working within the system to walk stepwise to a better policy is just more likely to see benefits now, and benefits for more Canadians now, like we've seen with the exemptions for a few Canadians. And it's less likely, especially if we keep it medical for now at least, and maybe forever. And maybe none of these medical access systems ever exist. Maybe waiting for prescription drugs is what Health Canada will give us. But I think that working within the system could get us stepwise to somewhere good. And I think we all need to be conscious of the level of inertia surrounding this from the history. And expecting too much change too fast it may just be setting us up for disappointment. And I'm looking forward to criticisms of everything I just said from the other panel members. So that's my vision.
And may your vision be so as well, David. And thank you all for your visions. And so let's take it out of the arena of criticisms. I know that you're lawyers and that's the training that you have. But I am interested, we do have some interesting questions to go to as well, but I'm really curious for like 10 minutes or so, if we could manage to give any constructive contributions to each other with what you've heard. Yes.
Doug, question for you. Do you see what you want what you want to have happen on First Nation territory? Do you see that being tied only to the specific psychedelics that were being used traditionally, which I know include psilocybin mushrooms on the West Coast? I don't know what else they include. Or could it go beyond that? And I know it's not geographically what was going on up there, but mescaline, for example, everyone thinks about that. And then if that, then maybe anything in this book. Do you see a reasonable outcome where, because this is the way traditional healing was approached, that the substance being used shouldn't be used to define it?
Yeah, no, I think that Aboriginal rights and our traditional medicines they're not sort of frozen in time back in, the ridiculous way that Aboriginal rights are framed in Canadian law, where you have to look at what was the situation at contact, and that's what's relevant. I think that there's the capacity to, for expansion of that. And so the vision that I have is that certainly that there is a powerful grounding in the traditional medicines and plants. That's part of the teachings that we have at least in the Coast Salish part of the world, is that you're in a relationship with those plants, and it's not part of the healing is about being in that relationship. So there is some dimension of the vision that is certainly rooted in that it can't just be sort of plants from another part of the planet. So if that's sort of the central pillar of the approach we're putting in place, then I think that's the powerful approach that can sort of upend the status quo that we experience. But that doesn't mean that the vision is only to be limited to that, because I think that when there's opportunities to find, when people are putting forward different kinds of therapies in that context, then I think that's something that should be absolutely part of the vision and the way that this manifests from the Indigenous perspective.
Who else? Comments?
Well, I'm very hopeful that government will regulate something that they should have been regulating a long time ago. It's the dog and pony show and the reasons for why something can't be done in the middle of a economic, health, opioid epidemic, overprescribed mental health crisis. Yeah. And yet everybody knows these substances work. Books are written on the subject. It really is this sort of, we have to wait till the man says go. What is this, a prison yard? Ultimately, I think government forgot who they worked for a long time ago. David mentions the social contract, which the side of that contract has not been honored for a long time. In fact, government really forgot who they worked for. And so I would like to see that balance adjusted. And I do have a lot of faith that the First Nations, you can do whatever you want, provided you have the case and the justification and the people have band and council support it, and you can demonstrate the connection with the land and in a practice. And that is a compelling story, and that's something that I've been assisting groups trying to tell. Because from the cannabis example, and having been a licensing advisor to a few First Nations groups, they did whatever they wanted to on the basis that the federal government would show up and they would take it from there. And ultimately, the federal government didn't show up. Federal government would ask them nicely to do a bunch of things, of which they would get what they really wanted out of the relationship. And it would certainly be different if Jennifer, David, and I decided to carry out a similar activity without that. So again, I really think the First Nations play a tremendous role in keeping government and the process honest. And I really, as much support and as power as I can give to a group that I look at as being the fourth level of government, and then their dealings with government is your relationship with the federal government when it comes to healthcare. So I am inspired, and I really encourage the First Nations to please play a role in driving this process, so it doesn't just look like, oh, this is something that we think we can do. No, it's something they should do. So please help us by driving and leading that process. And we'll do what we can at our end.
Yeah, I appreciate that commentary very much, Robert. And you know, I'm sort of I've always been a bit more of a kick the door in kind of person myself. I mean, if we're going to use that kind of analogy, I know that the law moves in and all the regulations and whatnot move in very slow ways, but I do think that on this issue, it feels to me that there's a requirement for a significant shift here. And when I look at all of the different streams that play into the Indigenous context, I think there's a real opportunity for that. And I don't think, I think that in addition to the safety, regulators and, judges, there's like everyone's worried about creating context of harm or, where safety isn't addressed and all of that. And when we're, I don't know like how long down the road when we're able to demonstrate clearly and to have clear information about safety and about, those issues, but more importantly, or equally importantly, just the success in helping people become better. I think it'll inevitably, I think it will lead to a major switch being switched that has to be switched in this whole scenario, right? That's my hope. Anyways, I'll stop there for further conversation.
So the idea of a traditional medicine regulation for traditional medicines that contain controlled substances does have wide application because it does create an environment for the use of indigenous medicines that couldn't be available without that kind of regulation, at least legally. So it widens access for everybody rather than it being piecemeal. Mm-hmm. And because we're looking at iboga, ayahuasca, psilocybin, mushrooms, and even poppy, right? So depending on what the medical application is. So I just think that we need something a little more comprehensive because with cannabis in Canada, even the medical application without having to go through and get a DIN it's almost insurmountable for people to create a good medicine because it's hard to patent. The other thing is, Rob, I'm not talking about that a government authority or a religious institution is necessarily sanctioning psychedelic chaplaincy. I'm talking about that you can be Buddhist, you can be Catholic, you can be Wicca. The thing is that there are people who have faith in their own faith, and they do a lot of good for their own people. But we also have a lot of people who are ill and dying. And psychiatrists and psychologists really can't service the level of need that is out there. So I just think they fill a hole.
Pastoral care. You can get a pastoral care license, and then Father Jack can apply for a 56 medical exemption.
It could
You're
be
done.
universal.
Like, that exists. You go do it.
It can be the universal church.
Well, but I'm saying
it has to be thoughtful, and it has to be in the context of that person's personal beliefs. And what is going to give them, can I finish?
Supervisor course.
Let them
achieve that.
Oh, I should be mediating. Rob, let her finish her sentence, please.
How are we going to offer people comfort? Are we going to our enlightenment, or to process those mystical experiences in an adequate way? There are not enough people out there to provide that. People have enough troubles accessing a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So clergy involvement with the appropriate training is a real possibility. And there are a lot of people who want some kind of, we do believe in a higher power. It's just, how do you want to frame it? To me, it's a higher power. It's all the same. It just has different cultural applications. But people still need a way to process. And I just think clergy is one way to help with that.
And I don't deny what you're saying whatsoever. But again, I'm also by the same token that clergy is one answer to a badly needed problem. So we agree. I just also, having been to Catholic school for a number of years, I'm not Catholic, but I was part of the 10% from non-Catholic from Richmond that played basketball at Vancouver College. And that religion is something that, yes, groups that want within that circle, that's up to them to determine. And if it involves members of the clergy, they can do that. They can do it now. I don't know what's stopping them. I'm just saying it gets difficult when you also have clergy in a position of authority and power, when these psychedelic medicines and the experience that you get from them. And again, I don't know what your experience is with psychedelic medicine and having taken them. I know you're certainly familiar with regulatory and policy, but ultimately that's a very unique element. And that is a multi-headed hydra. And so thank you for making and illustrating the point. But again, I think it has to be, each group needs what will work for them. And at the moment, just a solution from the government, that means that every group's going to have to apply for Section 56s, when if this is bad racial law that was done in the first place to marginalize groups of religious faiths and organizations, then I think the last thing they want is, unless it's their own group, telling them how to go through their process. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't know why we got so spirited.
So I'm looking forward for long term, that right now, because of all the research, it's a medicalized model. Yeah. And there are a lot of people that want therapy, but not within a medicalized model framework. Yeah. And I know there are people that are listening today that do provide therapy services underground, because there are people that want it and need it. So the question is, how do we create a model that can allow some of those people to safely work in the light?
I think it's a really valid question, and it's certainly a piece that CPA is a stand for is that we're not just supporting clinical use and in a therapeutic setting, but bringing in a spiritual component as well is really essential. And TheraSil has, I think it's TheraSil, has permission for now people who are training to be therapists to be actually able to take the medicine themselves. Otherwise, they're not really going to know what they're doing. Please go ahead, David.
Yeah, and I really like the point you made about the CPA, that it is not specific to therapeutic purposes. Because again, if that's all we care about, then we'd all go home, because there will be prescription drugs. It is going to happen.
Totally.
But to me, and that's, again, outside of First Nations, that's where I'm more optimistic about seeing something broader than that, is medical access in an analogous manner to cannabis is the easiest and most logical next step if we're going to do anything other than let these be prescription drugs. And if we think about the product level, where you're accounting for, because these substances are not without risk. I don't think they should just be sold in gas stations or put into ingredients in food in restaurants. You know, like I think that might be going a bit far, given where these substances take people, and especially when people don't know what they're getting into. And I don't think it's terrible to have warning labels and think about how we're moving from a prohibition state to a post-prohibition state. But once you have a product that people can buy, regardless of why they're buying it or under what pretext, I don't want to say pretense, then you have something that even if it starts medical, just like all cannabis did, it can soon become wellness. It can soon become, if I want to integrate this into my religious practices, I am completely free to do so. And if it's okay for me to buy psilocybin in a container that looks like this, then I can use it in the context of clergy or other religions, regardless of the religion. I can use it in that context. If I want to use it for personal development, I can use it that way. If I want to use it because it makes Pink Floyd sound better, I can do that. It's up to me, right? And I think that if we can get there with psychedelics in a safe way that doesn't increase the risk of harm, recalling that people can buy them right now, right? It's not like they're hard to access if you really try. So much like cannabis, if we think about the purpose of those UN conventions being to mitigate the social and economic consequences of abusing drugs, well, maybe putting them in these containers and charging excise duty and labeling them and warning them and making it a discussion you can actually have with your kids is how you mitigate social and economic harm. That's my view of what Canada did, while it contravenes a mandatory mechanism of the UN conventions, actually better serves their purpose and removes revenue from illicit actors, which is also in general a good thing. So bringing it back to psychedelics, once we have something that's regulated at the product level that isn't necessarily a prescription drug with a health claim, then we have something where maybe, like cannabis, it'll get sold outside a therapeutic context, even when we're ready socially for that. Because we are also, there are people that believe that these things should not be allowed, right? And that, I think we're in an echo chamber here. I think everyone on this webcast wants them to be regulated or at least not criminal. So all of us see it as obvious. But there is more than one perspective on this, and that's why cannabis products look the way they do. And I kind of think that was unavoidable. Someone just said we are ready to break free of indoctrination. Well, yeah, exactly. Everyone on this podcast is, or whatever we call this, everyone on this event. But the whole country isn't, and propaganda works. From the conversations I've had at dinner parties, recalling I live in Calgary, there are a lot of people very, very, very against liberalization of these laws, and I disagree with them profoundly. Every time someone tells me that a loved one of theirs has been badly, had their life ruined by drugs, when I ask them how prohibition helped their loved one, they just get mad at me, so there is no rationale to prohibiting them. So let's find a better way. And once we get products that can be purchased medically outside of pharma through medical access, you open the door to adult use and you open the door to anything that goes with that. Anyway, I feel I'm repeating it a bit too much, but I think once you have the product, the possibility of access outside of the reason it's being accessed today is there. And don't forget, we regulate food. We regulate everything that people consume. So I think, you know, if I buy psilocybin legally, I want to know how much is in there. Like, I think that's good, personally.
Thank you. I just want to make a case. We'll come back to you in a second, Jen. We do have lots of questions, but forgive me, everybody who's watching here. A lot of the questions will be kind of going back to earlier, and I do think we're in a really interesting conversation right now. So please forgive me for not reading out all the questions, and we have like 18 minutes left. I just want to suggest that there's an opportunity for cross-pollination here. And I hear well, you know, okay, First Nations, you're doing your thing over there and we're doing our thing here. And well, A, haven't we had enough of that in the world and in this country? And B, Canadian Psychedelic Association is committed to, as I said, to going further than just the clinical route. And what Gillian, sees as the opportunity, if we look at traditional use, well, where is the traditional use? Well, the traditional use, of course, comes from our First Nations. And so why we aren't working more actively, or can we please, find some strategies to work together? Because I don't think it's oh, you do that over here and we'll do this. It's like, please, let's forget all that old stuff and actually figure out ways where we can work together and create some new strategies. So Jennifer, you were up next.
Oh, no, I was just going to echo one of our chat commentators, Jeff, who said that there are many skilled therapists, psychologists, pastors, social workers, etc. No need for either or. And I think really, I mean, you're talking about beyond the therapeutic uses, but I think we need to get to the therapeutic uses first before we can even consider something beyond that. So,
but including traditional use in the therapeutic use, that's the thing. That's totally what I was referring to.
That's why I have part of why I think the traditional medicines, continued controlled substances regulation, helps that.
So we've got 15 minutes left. That means a couple of minutes with closing thoughts, flashes of inspiration. Where are you guys at? What's happening over there?
Rob, you're funny.
What's going on?
I was reading your comment about what the plants are talking about. The folks aren't
well,
listening.
I got Michael Stewart on calling me, basically. If you don't know who Michael is one of the reasons I got involved in the space. He was involved with the First Nations influenza strategy, well, in the Amazon, so Amazon Indigenous. So he's probably been listening to this dialogue, and he's probably going to give me an earful of all the points that I didn't make that I should have. But this is the start of a dialogue, and you know what Michael says is ultimately the plants are talking, but do folks know how to listen? And so I often joke that when people say, who are your clients, at the end of the day, they are the plants, and they're those who, again, are the voices for those that don't have one. And I mean, that's really where we're at the stage, is all of the panelists and everybody has a role to play in this industry and the involvement with it. I mean, all the points discussed tonight and views are just a starting point. And I mean, they're all good points. And if I stand corrected for my views, or if they were interpreted in a manner other than constructive dialogue, then my apologies to the group and to the listeners. But I think this is a great first point. But we haven't even got into the debates between natural, biological, traditional versus clinical. Because as far as I look at it, is the folks in the Amazon who've been doing it for 3,000 years have a lot to teach us, right? And we have a lot we can learn. And the answers are not going to fit in the system as it exists. So this is where, for me, you knock on the front door, and if they answer, great. But sometimes you got to go around to the back door and kick it in. And luckily, that's with having a charter. That's where we have doctrines of fundamental freedoms and minimal impairment with these rights, that unfortunately it will be medical access. It will be questions of conscience. And with First Nations, what can be done on their land according to their rules and their traditions. And again, I think standing shoulder to shoulder with what we can do on reserve and off the reserve together in concert is going to help with that dialogue in dealing with the federal government, because ultimately it's the federal government who has to make some accommodation in order to be able to have the dialogues and the visions play out the way that we're hoping.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rob. Any comments from you, Doug?
Yeah, no, I just really support that basic proposition that I know that I know what we want to achieve. And I've been hearing and learning about the work that you've all been doing in this space as well. And it seems to me that it makes an enormous amount of sense to find ways to coordinate and to have sort of common strategy about how to bring about the kinds of changes that are necessary. Mm-hmm. And so I'm committed to that basic idea, right? I mean, I think it's both, it's both the need to dig into the therapeutic dimension, but also for us, obviously, it's a spiritual important dimension as well. I mean, that's really what it's about. And so we've got, there's multiple different tools and pathways that I think we need to continue to talk about and see where there's alignment. We've got the powerful UN declaration and the provincial law that implements it, and the federal bill that, if it's passed into law, will be part of implementing it. And that creates immediate tension between the existing legal framework that has to be brought into alignment with the UN declaration that includes the powerful provision that I referred to in Article 24 about the right to traditional medicines. And so, my goal is just to help people. I want people to be better. And I want that to be as immediately accessible as possible and as widespread as possible. And I do want to get to a place where, it doesn't, if people are mature and knowledgeable and want to be able to access this stuff, then they should be able to do that. It shouldn't have to be through a therapeutic context or whatever. I mean, that's the goal. So I think that there's, the decriminalization element, or at least the, agreement not to prosecute stuff, all of those dynamics that are playing out. We've heard clearly from the provincial leadership about, speaking to Canada, saying we want to see decriminalization. There's a lot of sort of momentum and points of leverage and opportunity, I think, to grab a hold of. I think it just does require that the necessary steps to coordinate and to work together to push in a similar direction. So I think we've got the makings of a significant change here, but it requires hard work and coordination. So thanks.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We now have 10 minutes left. A couple more comments from you, Jen. I have a few things to say to wind up, and anything you would like to say to conclude, David. The floor is yours, but just a couple of minutes, please. Jen.
Oh, well, I look forward to seeing what happens. I do think that it would be great if we got to the point where people can grow their own mushrooms. Like we have with the Cannabis Act, people can grow their own plants, but yeah, I think let's take baby steps. And people are going to grow their own mushrooms anyways. So the question is how, if it's decriminalized, this is a whole other conversation. If it's decriminalized, does it matter if people grow their own mushrooms? Is it going to be a municipal thing? I mean, it's an endless dialogue. So, I mean, we're just touching on the surface of where things can go. And I'm really sort of looking at, I really was looking at the medical framework of things. I wasn't looking beyond. And David, thank you. I really do appreciate you talking about the other side of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess for me, much has been my instinct essentially, since I knew what psychedelics were, they're important. They're important for therapeutic purposes. They're connected to some cultures. They're also, I think, just important for human beings. And barring toxicity, which usually goes to dose, I think that's true of ayahuasca or peyote or ibogaine or psilocybin mushrooms or LSD or really anything in this book or this book. You know, like there are so many of these drugs that don't really hurt you physically. At least the evidence suggests that, and at least with reasonable frequency and intensity of use, because they can definitely be abused. Just like Netflix and donuts, they can be abused, and there are consequences to that abuse. But I think the correct amount of psychedelics in a person's life is a non-zero amount. I think the prohibition sells us short, the entire human race, it sells us short. I think it's a ridiculous and juvenile policy. And I'm really glad that we live in a country that has the Cannabis Act. You know, I love that we can buy cannabis products here, and that gives me a lot of hope. And the public prosecution desk book being amended to suggest don't, barring exceptional circumstances, don't seek convictions for possession. I think that's a promising step forward. I think Therasil is a promising step forward, and the other people who got in subsection 56(1) exemptions issued. I just think everything that's happened in the last 6 months is incredibly encouraging in Canada. And again, like I said at the start of the talk, I am thrilled and grateful to have the role I do in this. It's amazing. And you know, I look forward to what we're discussing 6 months from now, you know, personally or on another one of these events, because I mean, things are changing quickly, and it's wonderful.
It is wonderful. And this has been wonderful. So a couple of things. Somebody had written and asked how they get more information about decriminalization and what's going on in this world. And so I just want to tell you that the Canadian Psychedelic Association has our website, and psychedelic association.net. Please go on there. There's tons of information on there. We're adding to it all the time. And if there's something that you would like to know about that isn't on there, just email us, info@. Also, for all of you looking at the screen, you're actually looking at least 3 of our Canadian Psychedelic Association's legal advisory board. That would be Jennifer, David, and Rob. And Doug and I are going to have a conversation next week when we find the time to see how that might fit for him. I'm really encouraging him to join because, as I said, I really am interested in this not being a this and a that, but a cross-pollination. And I do believe that governments really love it more than anything when they can divide and conquer. And I think we just have to tell them that those days are over and demonstrate that by really working collaboratively together. So we're really honored and proud to have you guys on board with us as our advisory board for legal matters. And there's such rich discussions. And as we said, we just really touched on the surface, and there's so much more to say. So I do believe that we will be convening you again in a little while to do another webinar to share with our members what's the latest is, what's going on, and to get to actually answering some of our viewers and members brilliant questions that I couldn't quite keep up with because there was so much going on here. So please, again, forgiveness for that. And just a really big thank you for being part of this and working so hard and just having that commitment that we can't do it without the commitment. We're talking at the moment at the CPA about how we can elevate our involvement in this, you know, because when you get sometimes down into sort of the grunt of everything, it all looks a bit difficult, and then someone starts to be irritating, and it's all kind of, and so we are having this discussion with some advisors that are helping us, and the latest one is to actually ask, how can I be a good ancestor? So to think about that now and to start to question yourself and go, oh, am I being a good ancestor? And what am I doing at this very moment? Is that leaving the legacy that I want to leave for my family and whoever is coming next, and 7 generations ahead. So I want to leave you with that, all of you, just to question and just to think to yourselves, how could I be a good ancestor? What would that mean? How would that direct my actions and my way of being with the people that I meet? And in the meantime, while you're thinking about that, please join us. Please become a member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. We're growing leaps and bounds. We're about to adopt this really cool platform. It's actually called Mighty Networks, and it's really will be a very sophisticated way of having everybody be able to communicate easily, and chat rooms and all that kind of stuff that I'm not terribly versed with, but I know will make us feel like a real community and be able to really stay in touch with each other and stay more relevant with what's going on. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you all very much for being here this afternoon. Thank you all of you for joining us and participating, and thank you all for caring so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Julian.